The glare of the television lights was a physical assault, reflecting off the polished conference table and into Sandra Hayes's dilated pupils. Her usually impeccable uniform, now rumpled and stained with what looked suspiciously like coffee, seemed to mock her. The rhythmic click of camera shutters was a dirge, each snap a hammer blow against the crumbling edifice of her composure. Before her, a phalanx of grim-faced journalists and stoic federal investigators sat like an unyielding jury, their silence more damning than any shouted accusation. A voice, crisp and devoid of emotion, cut through the suffocating quiet. "Ms. Hayes, for the record, on what grounds did you, as a senior flight attendant, repeatedly and demonstrably violate safety protocols, engage in discriminatory practices, and actively participate in the systemic cover-up that ultimately led to the grounding of Global Airlines' entire fleet?" Sandra's mouth opened, a pathetic gasp escaping, but no words followed. Her eyes darted, wild and desperate, searching for a lifeline in the sea of condemnation. The once unshakable certainty, the smug sense of untouchable authority that had defined her, had evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal terror. She saw her reflection in the dark lens of a news camera, a woman stripped bare, exposed, and utterly broken. A tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a clean streak on her smeared makeup. It was over. Everything. The power, the prestige, the unquestioning obedience from her juniors, all gone. A single thought echoed in the cavern of her mind. How did this happen? 6 months earlier. The cabin of the Global Airlines executive suite was a sanctuary of hushed luxury, a world away from the clamor of the terminal. Plush leather seats reclined into near beds, champagne flutes chimed softly, and the low hum of the engines promised swift, serene transit. Julian Thorne, seated by a wide oval window, was an embodiment of this quiet sophistication. His bespoke suit, tailored to perfection, seemed less an adornment and more an extension of his own composed presence. He wasn't merely a passenger. He was a force, though one rarely wielded with overt display. At 35, Julian carried the gravitas of a seasoned statesman, refined by an Ivy League education and years spent navigating the intricate geopolitical landscape of global philanthropy. He managed the Thorne Legacy Fund, an organization his family had built not merely for charity, but as a scalpel to dissect and address systemic injustices across the globe. His current destination, a high-level summit on corporate ethics in Geneva, perfectly aligned with his mission. He was meticulously reviewing a brief on regulatory loopholes in international air travel, his brow slightly furrowed in concentration. Julian wasn't a man given to grand gestures or flamboyant displays of wealth. His power was in his intellect, his unwavering ethical compass, and his strategic patience. He observed, he analyzed, he planned. His movements were precise, his voice a measured baritone. Even now, amidst the subtle indulgence of first class, his focus remained absolute. He took a sip of still water, his gaze momentarily drifting to the clouds outside, a vast, indifferent expanse mirroring the complexities he often faced in his work. He was preparing, not just for the summit, but for the inherent challenges of disrupting entrenched power structures, a task he approached with the calm detachment of a chess grandmaster. Back in the main cabin, separated by a discreet curtain from Julian Thorne's tranquil world, a different kind of authority held sway. Sandra Hayes, a woman in her late 40s, moved through the aisle with an air of practiced efficiency that bordered on territorial ownership. Her smile, when offered, rarely reached her eyes, which instead scanned the passengers with a proprietorial gaze, cataloging perceived transgressions or mere inconveniences. She was a veteran of Global Airlines, a fact she leveraged at every opportunity. Her seniority was a shield and a weapon, making her unchallengeable in the eyes of most junior staff and a formidable presence to any passenger who dared to question her. "Madam, your bag is marginally exceeding the overhead compartment's designated space," she announced to a nervous young woman struggling with a carry-on, her tone clipped, yet saccharine. "While I appreciate your optimism, rules are rules. Perhaps you'd prefer to check it, at a nominal fee, of course?" The passenger, flustered, quickly conceded, her face reddening under Sandra's unwavering stare. It was a small incident, unremarkable to most, But to those who observed closely, it was a vignette of Sandra's modus operandi: exert control, assert dominance, and subtly remind everyone of her unassailable position. Later, a junior flight attendant, a fresh-faced young man named Ben, cautiously approached her about a passenger's request for an extra blanket. "Mr. Davies in 27B is quite cold, Sandra. We've run out in this section." Sandra barely glanced up from arranging miniature liquor bottles. "Then he can make do with his jacket. Can't he, Ben? We're not running a luxury spa. These things are accounted for. Next time, anticipate." Or perhaps he simply thinks he's cold. The dismissive wave of her hand signaled the end of the discussion. Ben, sighing almost imperceptibly, retreated, another victim of Sandra's casually wielded authority. She prided herself on being firm but fair, a self-assessment rarely shared by those who experienced her firmness. Her domain was the aircraft, and within its aluminum shell, Sandra Hayes was the undisputed, unchallenged sovereign. The flight had settled into its cruising rhythm, a monotonous hum that usually lulled passengers into a state of contented detachment. Julian Thorne, having concluded his review, stretched languidly, his gaze once again drawn to the pristine canvas of clouds outside his window. It was then he noticed something amiss in the adjacent row, beyond the privacy screen. A flight attendant, not Sandra Hayes, struggling visibly to secure an oversized carry-on bag into an overhead compartment. The bag, clearly too large for the designated space, was being forced, and the attendant, a young woman with a harried expression, looked on the verge of tears as other passengers began to cast impatient glances. The potential for the latch to fail, or for the bag to shift during turbulence, was a clear safety hazard. Julian, ever observant, waited for a senior member of the crew to intervene. When none did, and the junior attendant seemed close to giving up, he unbuckled his seatbelt and approached quietly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft but clear, addressing the junior attendant. "It seems that bag won't fit safely. Perhaps it needs to be checked or relocated?" Before the young attendant could respond, Sandra Hayes appeared as if conjured, her face hardening instantly as she took in the scene, a passenger, and a black one at that, daring to offer an opinion within her domain. Her lips curved into a tight, dismissive smile. "Everything is perfectly under control, sir," she stated, her tone dripping with condescension. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable back in your seat? We do have procedures, you know, which our trained staff are perfectly capable of handling." She emphasized trained, with a barely perceptible sneer, implying Julian's lack of qualifications. Julian met her gaze evenly. "With respect, Ms. Hayes, that bag is a clear breach of safety regulations. It's unsecured, and it's preventing the compartment from closing properly. Are you truly comfortable with that during takeoff or landing?" Sandra's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of icy indignation. This was not a polite request. It was a challenge to her authority. Her voice, though low, carried an edge that silenced the murmurs of nearby passengers. "Sir, I find your persistent interference and insinuation of incompetence highly disruptive. Are you suggesting I don't know my job? Perhaps you believe your status grants you special privileges to dictate our operations." Her eyes narrowed, deliberately scanning his expensive attire, lingering on his dark skin, a silent, pointed accusation. "Because from where I stand, you're creating a disturbance." The accusation hung in the air, potent with unspoken prejudices. Julian remained outwardly calm, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. He made no move to defend himself, merely holding her gaze. Sandra, emboldened by his apparent lack of retort and the growing discomfort of the other passengers, pressed her advantage. "I am warning you, sir. Any further disruption, any further questioning of my authority or our safety procedures, and I will be forced to report you upon arrival for interfering with cabin crew and potentially endangering other passengers. Is that clear?" Her voice was sharp, designed to humiliate and intimidate, a public rebuke intended to put him firmly in his place. It was a verbal slap, delivered with chilling precision, confident in its untouchability. Julian simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. He returned to his seat, not with the air of a defeated man, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had just confirmed a hypothesis. The incident, to him, was not an affront to his person, but a clear, undeniable data point. Back in his seat, the immediate aftermath of Sandra's verbal assault left no visible mark on Julian Thorne. He didn't fume, didn't clench his jaw, nor did his expression betray any hint of personal offense. He simply settled back, closed his eyes for a moment, and took a slow, deliberate breath. While Sandra, in the main cabin, was likely basking in her perceived victory, Julian was already several steps ahead, his mind a cold, calculating machine. During the incident, his hands had remained out of sight. A discreet digital recorder, barely larger than a thumb drive, had been activated, capturing every word of Sandra's condescending tone and veiled threats. He had also, with the casual grace of someone simply adjusting his watch, managed to capture a quick, clear photo of the oversized bag precariously lodged in the overhead compartment, time-stamped and geotagged. These were not acts of impulsive anger, but the precise, practiced movements of a man who understood the meticulous demands of evidence collection. The remaining hours of the flight passed in a quiet blur. Sandra studiously avoided his section, clearly content to let her warning resonate. Julian, meanwhile, finalized a crucial email on his encrypted tablet. It wasn't addressed to his father, nor to any personal lawyer. Instead, it was directed to the Ethical Audit Foundation, EAF, a discreet, powerful entity operating under the umbrella of the Thorne Legacy Fund. The EAF wasn't a PR machine or a legal firm for personal grievances. It was a highly specialized, independent oversight body designed to investigate and dismantle systemic corporate malfeasance, particularly when standard regulatory channels proved inadequate or compromised. His email was succinct, devoid of emotion, and purely factual. An incident report detailing the safety violation, the flight attendant's conduct, and the underlying tone of discrimination. Attached were the audio recording and the photographic evidence. The final line read, "Initiate full-scope systemic audit. Protocol Alpha 7 engaged." As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Sandra Hayes, radiating an air of smug satisfaction, stood at the front of the cabin, ready to make a grand show of calling airport security for the disruptive passenger. But Julian, having already disconnected from the plane's Wi-Fi, merely fastened his laptop into his briefcase. He made no eye contact with her as he disembarked, a faint, almost imperceptible curve playing on his lips. His call wasn't to punish one individual, but to expose and correct a deep-seated pathology. The hidden mechanism was now awake. Within 48 hours of Julian Thorne's encrypted email, the first ripples began to disturb the placid surface of trans-global airlines. Initially, they were so subtle, so seemingly innocuous, that they barely registered as anything more than administrative nuisances. A series of routine data requests landed in the compliance department. A granular audit of safety incident reports from the past 3 years, an inquiry into the standard operating procedures for cabin crew disciplinary actions, a request for aggregated data on passenger complaints regarding staff conduct. The emails bore the unassuming letterhead of a Federal Aviation Safety Board liaison and a relatively obscure corporate ethics oversight initiative. Mark Davis, the Director of Human Resources for Trans-Global Airlines, a man whose career was built on an uncanny ability to deflect blame and bury inconvenient truths, glanced at the flurry of internal emails with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Just another bureaucratic fishing expedition," he grumbled to his assistant, waving away a pile of printouts. "Probably some new intern looking to make a name for themselves. Process it, but don't waste too much time. Keep it high level, nothing too specific." He was a towering man with a booming laugh and an unshakable belief in the impenetrable fortress of corporate legal departments. Sandra Hayes, still basking in the glow of her perceived victory over the uppity passenger, felt no alarm. If anything, the lack of immediate repercussion confirmed her belief in her own invincibility. She had heard nothing from management, no disciplinary action, no uncomfortable questions. It merely reinforced the established order. She was protected. Over coffee in the crew lounge, she regaled a sympathetic colleague with a heavily embellished account of the disruptive passenger and her firm, justified handling of the situation. "Some people," she scoffed, "think a designer suit gives them permission to run the airline. Not on my watch." Meanwhile, the requests from the Corporate Ethics Oversight Initiative grew incrementally more detailed, more specific. They asked for training records, performance reviews for senior cabin crew, records of internal investigations into staff conduct stretching back 5 years. Mark Davis, initially annoyed, became mildly irritated. "Tell them our systems are proprietary," he instructed his team. Clogged. Under review. Whatever. Just stall. They'll move on. He was supremely confident in the local system. The intricate web of personal favors, delayed responses, and selective information release that had protected countless employees, and himself, from external scrutiny for decades. He saw no threat, only a temporary annoyance. He couldn't conceive of a force that operated entirely outside his sphere of influence, a shadow cast by a call made quietly and efficiently, not to his peers, but to a mechanism designed to dismantle everything he stood for. The nuisances from the Ethical Audit Foundation, EAF, though still operating under the guise of an oversight initiative, began to penetrate deeper into TransGlobal's corporate shell. The initial broad requests narrowed into targeted inquiries. They weren't just asking for safety reports anymore. They were asking for specific reports related to cabin crew misconduct, particularly those involving disruptive passengers and disputes over carry-on luggage from the past 3 to 5 years. Then came the requests for all internal communications, emails, memos, incident reports, involving Sandra Hayes directly. Mark Davis, still primarily focused on what he considered real threats like upcoming union negotiations, found these escalating demands increasingly vexing. "Are they seriously auditing individual flight attendants now?" he sneered to his second-in-command, Brenda, a woman whose loyalty was meticulously cultivated through small perks and veiled threats. "Tell them Ms. Hayes has an impeccable service record. Long-standing employee. Nothing to see here. We don't throw our people to the wolves over a single, isolated passenger complaint." He signed off on a prepared, boilerplate response, confident it would placate the unseen auditors. However, the EAF was not easily placated. Their team, a clandestine network of forensic auditors and legal strategists operating from a secure, nondescript office, possessed an almost preternatural ability to unearth obscure data. They cross-referenced anonymized public complaint databases with internal incident logs, looking for discrepancies. They ran sentiment analysis on employee forums and scanned for keywords in archived, supposedly deleted, internal messages. What they found was a disturbing pattern. Beyond Julian's incident, several prior complaints against Sandra Hayes, dismissed by HR as unsubstantiated or passenger overreaction, began to surface. A passenger claiming discriminatory treatment over a service dog, another alleging an aggressive confrontation regarding a child's dietary needs, a third detailing an unprovoked verbal attack over a minor procedural misunderstanding. Each had been systematically filed away, minimized, or simply ignored. The EF's strategy wasn't to confront, but to create avenues. Discreet, anonymous online portals were activated, linked to the Oversight Initiative, inviting TransGlobal employees to share their experiences regarding workplace culture and conduct, with guaranteed anonymity and protections. Fear, a potent inhibitor, slowly began to erode. Junior flight attendants, like Ben, who had witnessed Sandra's abuses firsthand for years, began to recognize the distinct shift in the air. The initiative felt different. It wasn't the usual corporate HR survey designed to whitewash. The questions were too pointed, too specific to the subtle power dynamics they lived every day. Slowly, tentatively, the trickle of anonymous submissions began. Tales of Sandra's petty tyrannies, her manipulation of schedules, her passive-aggressive bullying, her selective enforcement of rules, and how her connections in management made her untouchable, started to flood in. The EF team, led by a sharp, methodical investigator named Dr. Anya Sharma, began piecing together a mosaic of systemic abuse, all centered around a seemingly minor incident on a routine flight and one unyielding woman. The crack in Sandra's armor, once invisible, was now widening, revealing the rot beneath. The flood of anonymous testimonials and the deep-dive forensic audit soon revealed that Sandra Hayes' behavior was not an isolated aberration, but a symptom of a far more pervasive corporate illness. The Ethical Audit Foundation's team, spearheaded by Dr. Sharma, began to map out the intricate web of complicity that had allowed Sandra to operate with such impunity for so long. Their investigation moved beyond individual incidents and began to dissect the very structure of Transglobal Airlines' internal governance. They discovered that numerous complaints against Sandra, some quite serious, had indeed reached HR, but were consistently rerouted, minimized, or lost by a small, tightly knit group of mid-level managers who reported directly to Mark Davis. Performance reviews, even those containing negative feedback, were routinely adjusted before being filed. Disciplinary actions against her, when they were ever initiated, evaporated into administrative limbo. The EF, leveraging its unprecedented access and sophisticated data analysis tools, began to uncover disturbing patterns in the internal communication archives. Emails between Davis and his protégés, though couched in corporate jargon, hinted at a culture of protecting our own, a euphemism for shielding favored employees, particularly those who helped maintain a desired, if disingenuous, sense of order and control. They found records of training sessions that were never actually conducted, safety checks that were merely rubber-stamped, and internal investigations that were predetermined to find no wrongdoing. It became chillingly clear that Sandra's status as an untouchable wasn't simply due to her seniority or a strong personality. She was a favored operative within a corrupt microsystem, a reliable enforcer of a certain kind of order that privileged appearance over substance, obedience over competence. Her aggressive demeanor on flights, her willingness to intimidate passengers and junior staff, made her an unwitting, yet effective, instrument for a management structure that valued control and a superficial lack of incidence above all else. Dr. Sharma and her team discovered evidence of a system that actively discouraged whistleblowers, punished those who spoke out, and rewarded those who turned a blind eye. A junior safety officer, for instance, had filed a detailed report about recurring maintenance issues on a particular aircraft model, the very model Julian Thorne had been flying on, only to find himself summarily transferred to a remote, undesirable posting. His career effectively stalled. His report, along with others, had been classified, then conveniently forgotten. The investigation wasn't just unearthing a few bad apples. It was exposing the very roots of a systemic rot. The EF realized they weren't just dealing with one arrogant flight attendant. They were dismantling a corporate empire built on a foundation of negligence, cronyism, and a cynical disregard for ethical conduct and passenger safety. The stakes had been raised exponentially. This wasn't merely about justice for Julian Thorne, but about a complete overhaul of a compromised institution. The once dismissive tone within Transglobal Airlines' executive suites had curdled into palpable panic. The annoyances from the Ethical Audit Foundation, EAF, were no longer mere bureaucratic red tape. They were surgical strikes, each new request for information landing with the precision of a guided missile. The EF's relentless pursuit of documents, emails, and obscure safety logs had uncovered enough disquieting patterns to force Transglobal's upper management, led by the increasingly frantic CEO, Richard Sterling, to confront the undeniable threat. "This is an attack," Sterling blustered during an emergency board meeting, his face flushed. "Someone is orchestrating this. Who is this Ethical Audit Foundation? Are they funded by a competitor? A hostile takeover attempt?" His eyes darted nervously, searching for an enemy he could understand, one he could fight in the conventional corporate arena. Mark Davis, no longer smug, stood rigidly, attempting to project an air of control he no longer felt. "We've tried to stonewall them, sir, but their legal team is relentless. They seem to anticipate every delay tactic. They even know the specific names of some of our most discreet internal files." He avoided eye contact, knowing his assurances of an impeccable service record for Sandra Hayes now sounded hollow. The leadership decided on a counteroffensive. Their first move was to try and discredit Julian Thorne. They engaged a high-powered PR firm, notorious for its smear campaigns, to plant stories in less reputable online news outlets, subtly painting Julian as an entitled heir, leveraging his family's wealth for petty revenge against a hard-working employee. The narrative was simple, a privileged elite crushing the common person. Simultaneously, internal memos were circulated within Transglobal, urging employees to remain loyal and report any unusual external inquiries, subtly implying that cooperating with the EF could jeopardize their jobs. However, every move Sterling and Davis made had been anticipated by Julian and his EF team. Julian, well versed in the tactics of corporate warfare, had predicted their attempts to muddy the waters. His foundation had already established contacts within various media watchdogs and independent journalism groups, providing them with preemptive, fact-checked rebuttals to any potential smear campaigns. When the planted stories appeared, they were quickly flagged as biased and lacking verifiable evidence, often accompanied by critical analyses highlighting the PR firm's dubious history. Furthermore, the EF had installed secure, anonymous communication channels for trans-global employees, ensuring that the internal loyalty memos were instantly forwarded to Dr. Sharma's team. These attempts to intimidate witnesses only served to provide more damning evidence of systemic obstruction of justice. The EF released carefully curated, anonymized snippets of the internal complaints, showcasing the airline's pattern of ignoring safety concerns and covering up misconduct, subtly hinting that these were just the tip of the iceberg. The web of intrigue that Sterling and Davis tried to weave became a noose around their own necks. Each attempt to manipulate public perception or intimidate their employees merely solidified the EF's case, transforming what began as an investigation into a single flight attendant's behavior into an undeniable indictment of the entire corporate structure. The invisible war was intensifying, and TransGlobal's localized, corrupt system was clearly losing. The invisible war was no longer so invisible. The relentless pressure from the Ethical Audit Foundation, EF, began to manifest in very real, very public consequences. The routine inquiries from regulatory bodies escalated into formal investigations, backed by the meticulously compiled evidence from Dr. Sharma's team. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, announced an unprecedented, comprehensive safety and operational review of TransGlobal Airlines, citing an alarming pattern of reported discrepancies. This was no longer just about a single incident. It was about the very airworthiness of an entire airline. The first dominoes began to fall. 3 mid-level managers in human resources, all direct reports to Mark Davis and implicated in the systematic suppression of complaints against Sandra Hayes and others, were summarily suspended without pay. Their offices were sealed, their company devices confiscated. The official reason cited was internal policy violations, but everyone in the building knew the truth. Panic, a cold, creeping dread, began to spread through the corporate offices. The sense of invulnerability, once a defining characteristic of TransGlobal's corporate culture, was shattered. Mark Davis, who had once dismissed Julian Thorne's initial complaint with a wave of his hand, now found himself under intense scrutiny. His once booming laugh was replaced by a strained smile, his confident swagger by a nervous twitch. He was constantly on the phone, his voice hushed, trying desperately to rally his dwindling loyalists. But his local system was crumbling. Subordinates who had once relied on him for protection now saw him as a liability, a sinking ship from which they desperately wanted to jump. Whistleblower hotlines, once ignored, now received a deluge of calls from employees eager to save their own skins by exposing deeper layers of corruption. Sandra Hayes, completely oblivious to the scale of the impending disaster, still held on to a fragment of her former arrogance. She was temporarily reassigned to ground duties, a move explained away as necessary during the internal review process. She complained bitterly about the injustice, convinced it was a targeted attack engineered by the billionaire's brat, and a weak management that had caved to external pressure. She remained blind to the true nature of the storm, unable to comprehend that her actions had merely been the spark that ignited a much larger inferno. Julian Thorne, observing the unfolding events from afar, remained detached. He felt no personal vindication, only a quiet satisfaction that the mechanism was working as intended. He knew that the hardest part was yet to come, the public confrontation, the dismantling of an entire corporate structure, and the fight to ensure that systemic changes were not just superficial, but deeply ingrained. The higher system was not just investigating, it was now actively punishing, and there was no escape for those who had benefited from the rot. The countdown to Judgment Day had begun. The pressure on TransGlobal Airlines was reaching a fever pitch. Regulatory bodies, armed with the EAF's meticulously compiled reports, were threatening to revoke routes and levy astronomical fines. Internal investigations, no longer confined to low-level scapegoats, were now targeting the C-suite, and the previously impervious Mark Davis was on administrative leave, his legal team in frantic negotiations. But still, the EAF needed the ultimate, undeniable proof, the smoking gun, that would not only confirm the cover-up but demonstrate the deliberate, criminal intent behind it. Dr. Anya Sharma, poring over terabytes of seemingly innocuous financial transactions and calendar entries, believed the key lay not in the outward-facing documents, but in the subtle, digital footprints of the top brass. Her team had been painstakingly reconstructing deleted server logs and analyzing encrypted chat histories. They weren't looking for a direct confession, but for a pattern of behavior that pointed to deliberate malfeasance rather than mere negligence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a hidden folder within a discarded, old server that had belonged to the former chief financial officer, quietly purchased by the EAF during a routine liquidation sale months prior. Within it, buried under layers of outdated software, they found a series of audio files. These weren't official recordings. They were crudely captured snippets from internal meetings, likely recorded by the CFO himself as a personal insurance policy against future blame. One particular file, dated 3 years prior, stood out. It was a recording of a highly confidential executive meeting involving Richard Sterling, Mark Davis, the head of flight operations, and the former chief safety officer. The topic, a rash of minor but recurring safety incidents on the very aircraft model Julian Thorne had been flying. The safety officer was clearly advocating for an immediate grounding of the fleet for a comprehensive inspection. "We cannot afford a grounding, Michael," Sterling's voice, tight with impatience, stated clearly in the recording. "The Q3 earnings are paramount. Public confidence is fragile. Can we reclassify these incidents? Perhaps attribute them to pilot error or passenger noncompliance?" Then came Mark Davis's voice, smooth and insidious. "Indeed, Richard, and we have certain senior staff who are particularly adept at managing passenger narratives and deflecting blame. Sandra Hayes, for instance. She ensures that complaints don't escalate beyond her purview. We can trust her to keep things quiet on her flights." The recording continued, detailing a cynical plan to suppress safety reports, strong-arm dissenting employees, and manipulate incident data to avoid costly recalls and maintain stock prices. It confirmed that the local corruption, personified by Sandra Hayes, was not just tolerated, but actively orchestrated from the very top. It wasn't just a cover-up of her actions, it was a directive to ensure that the system, as they defined it, continued to operate unchecked, regardless of the risks to human life. Julian Thorne listened to the recording in the EF's secure facility, his expression unreadable. This was it, the irrefutable evidence. Not just proof of individual wrongdoing, but a chilling testament to systemic, calculated deception and a complete disregard for ethical responsibility. This smoking gun had been found, and it aimed directly at the heart of trans-global airlines. The invisible war was about to erupt into a very public, very destructive finale. The grand ballroom of the International Justice Center, typically reserved for high-level diplomatic assemblies, had been transformed into a temporary, but formidable, courtroom. Floodlights blazed, casting long, stark shadows across the faces of a packed gallery. Journalists, legal observers, representatives from global aviation authorities, and even a contingent of the Thorne Legacy Fund's most ardent supporters. The air crackled with a palpable tension, a sense of an impending reckoning. At the defendant's table sat Sandra Hayes, her face a pale mask of thinly veiled terror. Gone was the imperious sneer, replaced by a constant, nervous tick at the corner of her eye. Beside her sat Mark Davis, visibly aged, his once impeccable suit now ill-fitting, his usual bluster replaced by a defeated slump. Richard Sterling, the former CEO, looked like a hunted man, his eyes darting frantically, as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. Dr. Anya Sharma, calm and authoritative, stood before a massive holographic display, presenting the EF's case. She began with Julian Thorne's initial report, displaying the time-stamped photo of the dangerously overloaded overhead compartment and playing the crystal-clear audio recording of Sandra Hayes's condescending and racially charged verbal assault. The room bristled with murmurs of outrage. This, Dr. Sharma's voice resonated through the hall, was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a corporate culture fostered at the highest levels of trans-global airlines. She then seamlessly transitioned to the mountain of evidence collected, the suppressed safety reports, the manipulated performance reviews, the internal memos encouraging loyalty at the expense of ethics. Each piece of evidence was presented with chilling precision, cross-referenced, and irrefutably linked. Then came the hammer blow, the full audio recording from the former CFO's server. Sterling's voice, clear and chilling, discussing the reclassification of safety incidents to protect Q3 earnings. Davis's insidious suggestion of using senior staff, like Sandra Hayes, to manage passenger narratives and deflect blame. The room erupted. Journalists scribbled furiously, legal experts exchanged grim glances, and the faces of the trans-global executives at the defendant's table drained of all color. Sandra Hayes, unable to contain herself, sprang to her feet, her voice a shrill, desperate cry. "It's a lie. It's all a setup. He's a spoiled rich boy. He fabricated this. They made me do it. I was just following orders." Her outburst was pathetic, her words lost in the sea of indisputable facts. A security officer gently, but firmly, guided her back to her seat, her protests dissolving into incoherent whimpers. Mark Davis buried his face in his hands, finally comprehending the colossal scale of his downfall. Richard Sterling, his eyes fixed on the holographic display showing his own damning words, looked utterly broken, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. His entire empire, his carefully constructed illusion of power, was crumbling around him. The cold opening had come full circle. The audience now knew exactly how it happened. The finality of the proceedings hung heavy in the air. The pronouncements, delivered by a panel of high-ranking aviation authority officials and independent judicial experts, were stark and unequivocal. The evidence, meticulously presented by the Ethical Audit Foundation, left no room for doubt, no space for appeal. Sandra Hayes, her eyes wide and vacant, listened as the lead judge read her sentence. Ms. Sandra Hayes, for gross misconduct, discriminatory practices, and active participation in the suppression of safety protocols, your flight attendant license is hereby permanently revoked. Furthermore, you are found liable for civil damages amounting to several $1 million, to be paid to the affected parties, and the specifics of your actions will be forwarded to the relevant authorities for potential criminal prosecution. She remained motionless, a hollow shell of her former self, the full weight of her isolated actions now compounded by the systemic corruption she had served. Mark Davis received an even harsher judgment. Mr. Mark Davis, for obstruction of justice, systematic suppression of evidence, and direct complicity in a corporate culture that jeopardized public safety, you are hereby barred from holding any executive or management position within any publicly traded company. Your assets will be frozen pending further investigation into potential criminal charges of corporate negligence and fraud. He offered no protest, only a slow, defeated nod, the magnitude of his fall echoing in the silent hall. Richard Sterling, once the titan of trans-global airlines, was next. Mr. Richard Sterling, as CEO, you bore ultimate responsibility for the systemic failures and criminal negligence exposed during this inquiry. For gross mismanagement, corporate fraud, and the deliberate endangerment of public safety, trans-global airlines will incur unprecedented fines, amounting to billions of dollars, and will be placed under immediate, independent trusteeship. Its operating license is suspended indefinitely pending a complete structural and ethical overhaul. Furthermore, you, Mr. Sterling, will face immediate criminal charges for corporate malfeasance, fraud, and reckless endangerment. Sterling's face, already ashen, crumpled further, his head sinking into his chest. The corporate empire he had so meticulously built and so ruthlessly protected had not merely been damaged, it had been utterly annihilated. Beyond the individual verdicts, the panel announced sweeping changes to aviation regulations inspired by the EF's findings. New whistleblower protections, mandatory independent safety audits, and stricter penalties for corporate cover-ups were immediately put into motion. The implications were industry-wide, a seismic shift in accountability that would resonate across the globe. The local, corrupt system that had shielded these individuals, that had allowed them to operate with such casual disregard for ethics and safety, had not just been exposed. It had been dismantled, brick by painful brick. The higher, impartial system of justice, activated by a single, quiet call, had delivered its full, uncompromising verdict. As the pronouncements echoed through the silence of the courtroom, Julian Thorne stood not amongst the clamoring journalists, but in a discreet observation booth, a quiet figure in the periphery. He felt no surge of personal triumph, no fist-pumping jubilation. His expression remained one of calm reflection, a stark contrast to the chaos and despair unfolding at the defense table. His purpose had never been retribution for a personal slight, but the meticulous application of leverage to correct a fundamental wrong. The slap from Sandra Hayes had merely been the diagnostic signal, confirming the deeper pathology within the system. Later, at a press conference held by the Ethical Audit Foundation, Julian addressed the world with his characteristic measured eloquence. "Today is not about celebration," he began, his voice steady and clear. "It is about accountability. It is about recognizing that systems, no matter how powerful, are not immutable. When internal mechanisms fail, when corruption becomes endemic, higher, impartial forces must be engaged to ensure justice and protect the public good." He spoke not of his own role, but of the collective effort of the brave whistleblowers and the tireless work of Dr. Sharma and her team. Julian outlined the EF's proposals for systemic change. These included the establishment of a fully independent, International Aviation Ethics Board, with powers to conduct unannounced audits and protect employees who report misconduct. He also announced a significant endowment from the Thorne Legacy Fund to create training programs focused on ethical leadership and corporate transparency, not just in the aviation sector, but across all industries. His vision was clear: to build robust, proactive defenses against the very kind of systemic rot that had infected trans-global airlines. The story ended not with a triumphant cheer for a hero, but with a profound sense of catharsis for the audience. Justice, in its truest form, had been served. It wasn't merely the punishment of individuals, but the dismantling of a corrupt edifice and the promise of a more equitable future. The initial outrage sparked by a single act of arrogance had morphed into a catalyst for profound, industry-wide reform. Julian Thorne had not sought vengeance. He had initiated change, demonstrating that true power lay not in brute force or personal wealth, but in the strategic application of ethical principles and the activation of justice when all other avenues were exhausted. The system shut down was not an end, but the beginning of a new era of accountability.